Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. It's super nice to have an audience and to have this conversation, and feeling really excited to just have an open and exciting conversation about kind of the state of ESG, specifically within finance, but of course, this impacts industries, all industries. So yeah, I'm Lauren. I'm from Carbonhound. I'm just providing just a quick run of show, and we'll be taking questions at the end. But for now, I would just like to introduce our two guests and then pass it off to David to get started. So yeah, David can actually probably do a better job of introducing himself. So I'll pass it off to him, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you. So, name is David Frazer. I'm CEO of Fruuit Consulting, and at Fruit, we help corporations and investors navigate the world of sustainability. I started Fruit after leaving McKinsey Investments, one of Canada's largest asset managers, where I was director of ESG for two of Canada's largest sustainable equity funds. While at McKinsey, I utilized my experience in ESG ratings methodology at MSCI and Sustainalytics to help hundreds of companies improve their ESG scores. So that was the reason Fruit was started. About 9 months in now, we have a growing team of 11 consultants, advisors, and support, and clients in Europe, the Middle East, and North America. So during my career, the ESG investing space has grown regardless of who was in power in the US and elsewhere, and what the prevailing media narratives were. I would like to offer today a different perspective on this narrative on ESG, the perspective of the largest ESG sustainable investors who continue to amass billions of assets under management annually and are steadfast from our perspective, from what we're seeing from their data, in the use of ESG data to make investment decisions. When we look at the top 25 funds, sustainable funds by AUM, and the extent to which they stringently apply well-known ESG ratings methodologies to use, it challenges the narrative that ESG in finance is dead. We look at the top 25 sustainable funds to measure how the biggest pools of ESG capital are making decisions, and we came up with a specific methodology to determine what ESG ratings they use as a cutoff when making their investment decisions. So MSCI ESG is the largest and most reputable ESG rater, that's up to debate really, used by most of the large sustainable funds, and their ratings at MSCI go from AAA, which would be considered a leader, to CCC, which would be considered the bottom, a laggard. So the way we looked at it, if a fund had less than 25% of its overall capital allocated to a particular ratings category, say a triple B and below, we assume that fund had a strong preference for an A, AA, or AAA rated company. As an example, iShares ESG Aware Emerging Market ETF has an A cutoff, with only about 13% of companies in that fund rated below an A. When we apply this methodology across the largest 25 sustainable funds globally, we found that about 85% of them have an A cutoff. So in the age of the anti-ESG, is the big money in sustainable investing at least changing their ways? It seems not. Seems not at a high level. They still require robust ESG performance in their stock selection processes. So the use of ESG by the big money ESG investors appear to be alive and well. So considering with Carbonhound, how do carbon practices impact ESG ratings? Like, how is that a part of the story? I wanted to just comment briefly on three data points that kind of explain how relevant carbon is to this whole ESG rating story. 92% of companies disclosed scope 1 or 2 emissions in 2022, according to Thomson Reuters. About 93% of private equity executives indicated that they would abandon a deal if there was some carbon-related concerns. It's according to CDP. And about 85% of institutional investors consider carbon emissions as a critical factor in ESG ratings and investment decisions, according to MSCI. Now, given the title of the webinar, I wanted to touch on this Trump factor. And I wanted to look at it from a historical point of view. So we already had an experience with Trump in office before. And from the perspective of these large institutional investors, we wanted to see historically if they made any changes to their methodology, if they backed down in any in any big way, in any systematic way. And what we saw in Trump's first administration was hundreds of environmental regulations that were scaled back and a direct discouragement of ESG-based decision-making in retirement plans. But during the time, the top ESG funds did not change their tune. Their ESG strategies and commitments largely stayed in place. And there were even new large funds created during this time. It is my opinion, therefore, that it is unlikely that we will see any significant changes in their behavior moving forward, and they will continue to rely on ESG data quite stringently to make their investment decisions.
Okay.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much, David. I think it's really cool just to hear this perspective from kind of your company and also just understand the research you've done. And yeah, we are entering a new era for sure, and acknowledge that we've sort of been here before. So would love to just pass it over to Sanders to add some color around kind of global regulations and how this looks across kind of not just the states, but climate reporting in general and kind of what that's influencing private sector to do too. So Sanders, off to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lauren. So I think, look, at the end of the day, it's all about risk, right? So whether it's insurance providers in Florida and maybe now California thinking more deeply about the risk they're taking on, or whether it's banks thinking about the same thing when they're giving loans to organizations. So fundamentally, what's driving that risk, right? So we've obviously got huge environmental factors that are occurring right now. And that's driving physical risk, of course. You know, if if your manufacturing facility burns down, then it's gonna be hard to extract value from that and pay back your loan, right? It's gonna be harder to get insurance on that factory to to rebuild it. So thinking about risk from a financial perspective is obviously incredibly important, and looking at physical risk in particular is really valuable. However, there's other risks too, because all of this physical risk has created an environment where politicians and corporates have been forced to take action as a result. So that's getting translated into revenue risk for many of these organizations as well. And one of the ways that we typically look at that at Carbonhound is that, when we look at the 70,000 companies that are going to be impacted by climate regulations worldwide, they're going to be looking at their supply chains as part of that. And so by 2028, you're going to have over 4 million suppliers and increasing impacted by climate regulation. It's going to impact their profitability, right? Which obviously matters when you're thinking about financial institutions extending credit, or if you're an investor looking at who you want to be investing in. Do you want to be investing in the company that's winning larger deals and securing those contracts with large international supply chains, or the one that's just holding on for dear life and is losing those contracts because they're not able to keep up to the new requirements that these large corporates have? And it's significant because if you look at carbon tariffs, in some cases they'll increase costs by over 45% to end clients if we start thinking about the carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU, which is coming into place now, and people are going to start paying those fees out in 26, or whether it's just the fact that it's a requirement to work with a Fortune 500 business due to those regulations like CSRD and the California SB 251. And increasingly, what we're seeing is that non-compliance is becoming increasingly punitive as well. So, especially looking at, let's say, greenwashing claims, looking at Europe and the UK, that can cost you 4% of your international turnover, right? Like not your profit, your turnover. So that for some companies could be 20% plus of their profit for the year gone because of that. I'm going to progress this slide. There we go. So at the end of the day, it's really just about like, how do businesses help protect and grow their relationships with larger customers, meeting those changing regulatory requirements, increasing the profitability and efficiency of their operations, because climate and carbon is simply just another way to look at your operations through a different lens to address those particular challenges. And so lastly, how do we work with clients to decrease the risk, increase the amount of growth, and really help them turn what could be a weakness into a strength, and improve the quality of their business, right? Which then improves the access to capital as well as your ability to raise debt or equity from large institutional players. So fundamentally, at the end of the day, we have to think about not just the physical environment, but how the regulatory environment is impacting the value generation at these businesses. And that's why, in my opinion, it's important not just to consider, like from an investment perspective, to consider the kind of these other components to the equation as it relates to who are the businesses that we think are going to be winning in the future, and who are those that are looking backwards and looking at negative or headwinds really when it comes to selling their products internationally.
Cool. Yeah, it's really interesting to see kind of on every scale. Like you've got the small companies who are impacted by their largest customers, but those large companies and large corporates are being impacted by these investment decisions. And so there's kind of just this massive kind of flow through impact of regulation and ESG. Um,
I've got this image of a champagne tower, right? At the top, you've got all the investors, and then it's just kind of trickling down.
Yeah, and I think like the thing that I'm sure a lot of people who are tuning in are really interested in is just trying to understand like, okay, this has been the case for some time, but what does it look like in the future? And for companies who are already stretched a million different ways, trying to meet customer demands, trying to deal with increasing price of supplies, all of these costs that seem to be going up, and then looking at ESG as kind of like a cost center. Just curious to see how you would both respond to that mentality that a lot of companies are kind of falling into, given the reality of the pressures they're feeling.
I would start off by saying, in today's sustainable compliance world, it's not an option for corporations in particular to avoid at least aligning with their industry best practices. So the risks, I think, are well known, being well documented, and most corporations, I think, are already behind it. But yes, I can tell you through my experience with clients, but also on the corporate side, the ESG departments are considered cost centers for the most part by the least savvy of corporations, and as such, they're given limited budgets and not a lot invested in R&D. It's difficult to get projects started, et cetera. There's a whole lot of challenges for ESG teams and corporations, but not in all cases. And I think that's going to continue to change as ESG becomes more mainstream and corporations recognize all of the different risks associated with it. But if you consider ESG as a key component to attracting more investor capital, then the story completely changes, and you might not look at ESG as a cost center, but more as an opportunity to bring in more money to the company. Depends on how you look at it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think if you look at I was just trying to find this study, because I think there's been a bunch of studies out there that have shown that there's very clear increases in terms of the margins that you're able to produce when you think about differentiating, especially commoditized products on a sustainability lens, rather than just looking at price and quality, right? So I think there's a lot of opportunities throughout the value chain. So to David's point, I think we work a lot with financial institutions, and we've talked to them a lot about sustainable finance, right? And when you look at sustainable finance, it's about how do we expand the access to capital that these businesses have in order to make those investments in typically efficiency projects, honestly, to improve the innovation in their organization and their ability to compete. And so I think it's not just about access to investor capital, it's also about access to debt facilities that you might not be able to get otherwise, and extend the amount of credit that you might be able to access to invest in your business. And then on top of that, how do you look at the increasing your revenue, and increasing your margins as part of that equation too? So I think that there's, for sure, I can understand why the perception would be that ESG is, really a cost center, because I think the way that a lot of businesses look at it is they say, well, we have to do this because this regulation has come into place. But I think that the key question is like, okay, how can you use this as a value driver for our business to create better products, right? We were at one factory where they're reducing their energy costs by 10% a year, right? I mean, that's meaningful when you're looking at these manufacturing facilities from a cost perspective and makes them more competitive when you've got new players coming into the space. So, um, yeah, I truly believe that if sustainability is done right and you don't have kind of a siloed function at an organization where they're really just focused on reporting and it actually gets integrated into the business, it becomes a new way for companies to and employees to look at their role and figure out how to become more efficient. And oftentimes that's really exciting for especially these like lower level staff who, don't necessarily to have that big impact, at a corporate level, but they can see that their suggestions can get put into place and save significant amounts and also do something for the environment, which is what a lot of people who are kind of under the age of 40 really care about. And that helps with employee retention. It helps with all sorts of other things as well, and attraction, that are huge cost centers for many of these organizations. So I think it's like, how do we take a more holistic view of the value, both from a culture perspective, an access, an equity investment perspective, as well as a kind of access to debt perspective, and roll all of those together to really get a better understanding of the total value that ESG can bring to the equation. And I think that's something that a lot of ESG professionals are trying to do right now, but it is hard, and sometimes it can take a minute for that ROI to kind of work itself through the system, especially if you're not tracking your carbon and your costs related to that. It can be really difficult to quantify those business cases, because I think traditionally we've seen a lot of organizations who kind of go for the story, but then they're not doing the math behind it. So it's hard to then go back and justify the business value that's being generated.
Yeah, when you take away the politics and the political narrative around ESG, it's really about how resilient a company will be in the long term, right? So take away the acronym, take away the ratings companies and all of the feelings associated with it. All of the factors that they're really looking at are central to a company's survival long term. And if companies leverage the different types of ESG data and ESG information out there are many examples of companies who have used that to expand their revenue, just by, for example, putting in place programs to track customers from different demographics. That can lead to further investments in those demographics that brings in more revenue over time. I can think of 4 or 5 different examples of companies that kind of were playing around with the idea, had to gather the data because of ESG compliance reasons, and ended up making new products because of it. So there's a lot of crossover, and I think hopefully we move past this political phase that ESG is in and more back to its roots, which is long-term sustainability of a company and what matters with regards to that.
Yeah, businesses want to do businesses with companies that they feel like are in a long-term stable position to be able to deliver their products and services, right? Which is why I think, climate's increasingly going towards the way of kind of like security, right? Like info security, where you have to have your SOC 2 designation, right, in order to do business with a company of any size, right? I think increasingly, as we start to understand the value of climate in terms of longevity and risk, it's going to become, and it already is, we look at green procurement cycles, those are only continuing to increase in terms of the amount of sustainable procurement policies that we're seeing worldwide. I think what would be really interesting, I know that David, you really focus on kind of ESG ratings, right? So I'd love to maybe dive a little bit more into that and just get an understanding of, like, for people who've never had or gotten ESG ratings, maybe talk us a little bit through kind of what that process looks like, why it's important for businesses that maybe aren't massive multinationals, that and how it can, like, what the benefits might be for them to think about their business and improving their ESG rating.
So ESG ratings are a tool for investors. That's the first thing. It's the audience for ESG ratings are institutional investors for the most part, who use the information as a risk mitigation in their risk mitigation exercises. So it's relevant and applied, these ratings, by companies like MSCI ESG, like Sustainalytics, like ISS ESG, like S&P, Dow Jones Sustainability Index, you name it. And they rate publicly listed companies who have public stock on usually a AAA to triple C range or something similar to it. And what they're doing is helping investors to identify which companies performed best on these non-financial factors. That's what it's all about. As a way to layer the financial analysis that they do. That's ESG ratings in a nutshell. And corporations are, some, not all, are eager to get the highest ratings possible. One, as a way to simply ensure that their programs and policies match like what's considered a best practice, or at least within their industry. But two, to get some of those investor dollars that I was referring to earlier, from that $41 trillion dollar pool USD of ESG assets under management. So whether or not they actually want to make a change within the company, companies are really eager to improve those ratings to get access to that pool. So I think that's really, considering who the audience of these ESG ratings is, that's really what it's about. Companies, corporations, putting in place the best practices possible under things like financing environmental impact for a bank, or carbon emissions for an oil and gas company, or human capital development / labor management for a utilities company, etc. Putting putting programs and policies in place that are best practices in order to avoid some of the risks of not managing your employees or your governance well, but also just to get good standing within the investor world, and and be the company that these investors want to choose among peers.
And just out of curiosity, like from your experience of working in this space, and from the investment, the other living on the other side of the fence for a little while, like, can you tell us any stories or examples of kind of a tangible difference that's made in terms of the impact that good ESG ratings have had on businesses? I'm just curious to, playing devil's advocate a little bit, right? Because I think we can always say, yeah, it's great, these are great, but like, what's the actual, like, I'd love to hear some, if you have any examples or stories that you can tell about businesses where it's either materially helped them or hurt them.
So put yourself in the position of a CFO of a company. How have ESG ratings helped or hurt them in the past? So a couple ways. We're working with the client right now to understand if they raise their ESG ratings by one notch, which of that big pool, the top 25 investors, would they attract, versus which ones would they still kind of not be eligible given their ESG ratings, given the way that they look at ESG ratings. And we are in the process of estimating how much their stock price could change, and the resilience of the stock price, given that these sustainable investors are usually longer term oriented, and so they're in for longer than most. As such, it's a more reliable pool of investors that stick around for a longer time. They're not selling out because of the next news story, etc. So I don't want to spill my client's information, but there was definitely positive inflows from the sustainable investment world that we modeled if they improve their ratings. And there are a lot of examples of companies out there. I mean, I suppose they wouldn't, you would have to do a study, I guess, to identify whether or not the boost in your stock price over time was because of a boost in ESG ratings. I have seen companies give those examples. But I guess the overall idea is that you attract the kind of investors that pay attention to ESG ratings quite closely, and that happens to be the biggest ESG investors in the world.
Cool. Yeah, I was just about to jump in and put that across the screen here. So we've got a great question from somebody who's tuning in, and this sounds like a David question. So,
could you share which ESG ratings components you prioritize? So, you being, I suppose, someone who worked at one of the shops, when evaluating financial institutions' exposure to carbon-intensive sectors. Additionally, do you consider the inconsistencies in ESG rating methodologies across different agencies to be a challenge for investors making informed decisions? Okay, that's an interesting one. So with oil, so let's just take the oil and gas sector, which is the sector I haven't worked on as much, but there are members of my team that have. There are key issues like biodiversity and land use. That's quite common for them. Their carbon emissions, obviously, would have a higher weighted role within their ratings than, say, a bank. community relations, given for most extractive sectors, oftentimes dealing with indigenous communities, etc. They should have robust programs in order to do that in the best way possible. Governance is a key issue for all companies that are rated by these agencies. And that's the bulk of it. Toxic emissions and waste for oil and gas company, obviously very material. And I think that covers the bulk of it. And those are key issues specifically at MSCI. The other rating shops, and you bring those up, have slightly different methodologies. So there is a challenge in that, because it means that investors have to decide which one is most robust, which one makes most sense for them. And in doing that, obviously, there's a lot of bias that creeps in. I think if we remember that these are simply opinions, these aren't facts. A company being a AAA company is just one opinion of that company's non-financial factor performance. And so in that sense, I think it's quite good to have a variety of different opinions in this new burgeoning field. Until we get to a point, we're not even close, of a global ESG standard, like a real one that everyone is on board with, like GAAP for accounting. Until then, we're going to continue to have to grapple, particularly the investment world, with diverging, sometimes ESG ratings, methodologies, and results. But if we start off from the assumption and a reminder that these are simply opinions, and if you stack opinions on top of each other, maybe you get a more informed view, then it's good. It's good to have more than one. We should have more.
Which ones do you typically point customers towards that you think are particularly good? Because if there is a wide variety of quote unquote opinions, I'll be honest, there's certain people's opinions that I will value more than others, right? So how do you navigate that?
So I have no opinion on that, especially not one that I'm going to voice right now. What I am going to say is that where is the big money investing their trust? It's MSCI, it's Sustainalytics. Those are the two biggest shops. The last time I checked, between the two of them, they were about 85, almost 90% of the institutional investor market for this, which is the primary audience, if not the only audience. And so that's who they trust. That's who they're using, MSCI in particular. And MSCI has had a long history of doing this. They went through a phase where they bought up a lot of small shops that were doing the different components of ESG ratings and made what is now known as the most well-regarded and I think most used ESG ratings out there.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm wondering, companies who were public before and then have gone private or are trying to go public, where would you recommend they start when it comes to this kind of thing? I mean, obviously just operating good business is always a good place to start, but if folks are kind of starting to think about this, what's the easiest place to start and kind of what can have the biggest impact on their ratings when they do go public?
Yeah, so the good thing about these ratings methodologies is that they've done a lot of research into understanding like what are the business practices around these different areas, like I mentioned, like toxic emissions and waste or labor management or what have you. And so no matter the size of your company, they've done a good job at like identifying the material issues that most companies within different industries are affected by. So whether or not you're publicly listed, the indicators that they're asking are relevant for every company in that industry. As long as you're pumping oil and gas out of the ground and selling it, if you're pre-profit or not, you're facing those same toxic emissions risk and waste risks as a large oil and gas company, just as an example. So paying attention to it I assume these companies eventually want to be big public listed companies, at least some of them. So preparing for it by looking at what's considered material and making sure that your performance at an early age, or at least the framework is in place to allow for good ESG performance in the future. But that framework that's there for these big publicly listed companies is relevant for small companies, for private companies. And they should use them to guide them towards considered best practice.
I'm just curious, like, are there any in your career that what you've seen, like what are the most common gaps that you see when people are starting out?
At what stage, like which kind of company?
Pick your poison. Yeah, I mean, it could be, yeah. Like, I'm just curious as to, when you're just starting out, like, what are the most common areas that you're typically advising on?
Disclosure and wording, and missing policies altogether. So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about like what indicators are used at these different shops to make their assessments. And because these are all different opinions, there's a range of different indicators per key issue that you'll see across the different shops. So there's a lot of confusion about which one do we prioritize, or does this even matter? I get a lot of questions. I did a lot of research in the past on diversity, equity, inclusion within the workplace. I get a lot of questions about like to what extent does that matter? Those numbers, like that diversity data matters for ESG ratings, and sadly, not much is my answer. So if a company, for example, is looking specifically to raise their ratings, maybe that doesn't matter as much. But if it's a company looking to advance, really their programs on the human capital development, it does, regardless of the ratings. So I spend a lot of time teaching and training. Thankfully, that's a part of who I am. I come from a family of teachers. My mom was. So I enjoy it. But there's a lot of demystifying, like shining light on this black box of ESG ratings, like explaining why is this important? Why should we even care about it? That's the first conversation that I have with most companies, particularly if its ratings is not something that they've invested in before.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So yeah, we did have some time for questions or more questions from the audience. So I just want to note for anybody who's still watching to just check your comments and questions up on LinkedIn, and we can put them over here. But I think for me personally, there's been a lot of sort of negativity and just stress and confusion around kind of the state of all of this work. And so I kind of did just want to end on something a bit more positive and ask a question to both of you and just kind of ask, in this environment, what is something that either gives you hope or that you're looking forward to, or that you can confidently say you're excited about when it comes to companies who care about ESG, or when you're thinking about this industry as a whole?
I can go first if you want, David. Honestly, I think the thing that gets me most excited is just seeing how technology is continuing to push the envelope in terms of what's possible. And just looking at solar or wind, for example, just how cheap it is compared to the fossil fuel alternatives, and how we've gotten to that point now where renewables truly are competitive or beating, traditional energy sources in terms of, cost per kilowatt hour and speed that can be of deployment, et cetera. Right. And I think that to me is super, super exciting, because in the end of the day, we still live in a capitalist culture. We still, everything does come down to dollar and cents, in addition to the fact that we obviously have social, elements that we have to account for. Like, we have to live in a world that we want to live in, for example, and have clean air to breathe. But fundamentally, it's really about how do we align what's best for the environment with that system. And I think just looking at the technology curve and the cost curves that we're seeing on a lot of the decarbonization side of things, I think I'm super excited about that, because it tells me that I think we might be past that critical point where it doesn't really matter what the political environment is. It's going to be cheaper to run your business using more green energy than it is otherwise. And I think that's what gets me really excited. So I think we have to really make sure that we stay focused on how do we help businesses run more efficiently by using technology that's more sustainable, in order to continue to reward those investments that investors and companies are making in that transition.
I'm excited about where ESG is now. I mean, when I started out in ESG, most people I spoke to, everyone in my family, did not know what that acronym was. And then it became a news story, and then it became something that even presidents and prime ministers were talking about. So it went from an unknown space to like this, what we're talking about today, which is quite exciting, even though just think about it from that point. I think the folks who were in ESG very early, before it was known, wanted to see this happen, and it's here, and we're kind of overwhelmed by it, but it's here. So that's one positive thing. I think the second one is, and you might find this ironic given what I said in this call, but the traditional ESG ratings methodologies that exist are too company and profit focused. And I think the investment world, but also the ESG community, so the folks who've been who work in corporations, who work at the ratings companies, who work for consulting firms, etc., they want to see real impact. They're kind of tired of talking about risk mitigation and tying ESG to financials. That we're entering this new phase of ESG that is pushing back against that anti-ESG backlash and saying, well, what about the planet and society? Forget profit. What about just that? How can investors invest in a way that improves communities, improves the climate situation, improves the toxic emissions and waste, et cetera, that comes out of our industries? And so I think we're coming together on this. I'm having a lot of conversations with investors about, well, what's ESG 2.0 that is really about the environment and society and nothing else, that looks at companies not by how their profits are going to be affected by ESG issues, but how the environment and society will be affected by their actions. And I'm near the end of building a rating system that does just that. So that's going to be the second webinar, I guess.
That sounds awesome. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, it's a very comforting reminder to just reflect on how far we have come. It's easy to be critical, and I really appreciate that because, yeah, it is easy to kind of spiral. And I think to that point, it's sort of, we're talking about this from like a giant institutional investor level, but then also acknowledging that like we're individuals who work at companies who are part of communities. And so it's like the onus is not totally on the individual, but as an individual, what can you do within your company or
For
within
sure.
your environment to kind of push this along? And there's good people out there. So yeah. Yeah, don't see any more questions coming through from the side. So just if there's anything else that either of you want to share about this question of is ESG dead in finance, feel free. And otherwise, we'll make sure to send this out to everybody who's registered and follow up.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Appreciate your time.
Bye-bye.